Good afternoon. My name is Joe Marighi. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the interim director of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities School of Social Work. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the school that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work, as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. I am very pleased to welcome everyone to this landmark conversation on the importance of history in social work education, research, and practice, brought to you by the Social Welfare History Group with the support of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities School of Social Work. It is truly an honor for our school to host this important event. We have long been stewards of historical scholarship. The Social Welfare History Group was established in 1956, and early members and leaders were Dr. Gisela Konopka, a well-known School of Social Work faculty member, and Dr. Clark Chambers, a noted American historian and University of Minnesota faculty member. These two scholars were quite active in their careers. As early as 1960, Dr. Chambers was seeking information from members about the state of their local archives that held social welfare material. He and Dr. Konopka served as chair and vice chair of the group, and Konopka as chair and Chambers as vice chair in 1961, and then switching positions in 1962. In 1964, the University of Minnesota, under the leadership of Dr. Chambers, was awarded a grant by the Russell Sage Foundation to begin an archive of materials on the history of social welfare in the United States during the 20th century. The first gift from Helen Hall consisted of 27 file cabinets of the survey and survey graphic, both important social reform journals that her husband, Paul Kellogg, had edited. Dr. John Kidney, the director of the School of Social Work, and Dr. Konopka provided assistance in this endeavor, which developed into the now renowned Social Welfare History Archives at the University of Minnesota. Archives that house significant records in scope and importance. MSW and PhD students were fortunate to be taught social welfare history by Dr. Chambers beginning in the late 1970s. The course was cross-listed in the history and social work departments. He taught this course until the early 1990s when Dr. Megan Morrissey, his teaching assistant and PhD candidate, took over. Dr. Morrissey became the associate director at the school and continued to teach the MSW and often the PhD history courses for the next 25 years. She was also a member of the Social Welfare History Group, reviewing proposals for the Council on Social Work Education's annual program meeting and serving as a discussant at paper presentations. A final example of our commitment to social welfare history included a speaker series inspired by Professor Esther Wattenberg, the former director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, and Clark Chambers. The series, titled "To Promote the General Welfare," brought nationally recognized social welfare historians to the University of Minnesota to share their thoughts on the building of the American social safety net. During the 1987 and 1988 academic year, in recognition of the 200th anniversary of the American Constitution, historians and leaders in social welfare, Michael Katz, Gerald Grobe, Mary Frances Berry, and Leila Costin, discussed the federal role in securing social well-being. For more than 40 years, history courses have been a required component of our MSW and PhD curricula, We, like our forerunners, have recognized its tremendous value, and we are pleased to continue playing a role in the leadership of the Social Welfare History Group, and we are excited to hold this conversation among the Social Work Academy. Thank you to the deans, directors, faculty members, archivists, and students who are attending this important event. I wish you an engaging and productive conversation.
Welcome and greetings on behalf of the Social Welfare History Group. I'm Stephen Monroe Tomczak, president of the Social Welfare History Group and professor of social welfare policy at Southern Connecticut State University Department of Social Work. We are extremely grateful to have so many prominent social welfare historians, including former leaders of the Social Welfare History Group, in attendance today. Following our panel presentations, there will be a facilitated question and answer period for panelists using the chat and a time for verbal comments and questions. Please be sure, of course, to keep your microphones muted while we have the open question and answer period at the end. Send us your questions using the direct chat function to our facilitator, Jacob Otis, who will field them. At the very end, we will have a discussion section where people can raise their hand, ask questions, make comments about some of the issues raised in our panel discussion today. Without further ado, I want to begin the panel. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves and deliver their remarks. So let's start with our first panelist, maybe Abramovitz.
Hello, everybody. I'm the faculty. I teach social policy at Silberman School of Social Work. And I also am the co-chair of the National Social Work Voter Mobilization campaign. But today I'm talking with my history hat on. First, I just want to thank the University of Minnesota for hosting this and all the hard work that went into producing this webinar. So, has social work mismanaged the study of history? We started with this question. As scholars and educators, we should shoulder some of the blame. But as historians, we also know that we are products of our times. So to understand the times, it helps to periodize history. In my own study of the history of welfare state, I identify 3 policy eras, and you'll see them identified on the slide: the laissez-faire era, Keynesian, and the neoliberal areas. In each era, a major economic crisis restructured the relationship between the market and the state to restore economic growth and mediate social conflict. The standard historical accounts of social work, well known to many, but maybe not to all in this room, detail how each period shaped social work's pursuit of professional recognition. In each era, social work's need for markets, funders, a scientific method, plus just the overall political climate led, some would say required, the profession to privilege casework and to marginalize macro social work. Although some workers, social workers, always resisted these pressures. These otherwise rich accounts say little about how social work managed, or should I say disappeared, the study of history. Therefore, this review will treat the marginalization of macro social work as a proxy for how social work managed the study of history in each period. The laissez-faire period. So this was characterized by rapid industrialization, urbanization, monopolization, first Black migration, and social unrest, which sparked progressive reform. Then we had World War I and the Red Scare, which chilled social reform. So in this social work, in 1915, Flexner urged that to be a profession, social work needed its own techniques and educational programs. In 1929, Porter Lee urged social work to focus less on cause or social reform and more on function or theory, method, and technique. In between World War I and the post-war, in between World War I, the post-war Red Scare and prosperity led society, but also social work, to retreat from the poor, abandon social reform, and repress dissent. Main Street social social work replaces its sociological understanding of individual problems with the psychiatric or Freudian model that often adjusts people to their environment and tends to mediate social tensions. Social work's graduate programs at the time, professional association journals, all agreed that social work and social reform did not mix. In sharp contrast, Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, and other Black colleges are teaching community work and the Black experience in America. The Keynesian period, historic forces that we see first in the 30s, the economic crisis, the stock market crash, and the Depression forced the federal government to step in. Widespread suffering, New Deal programs, and social unrest challenged psychiatric casework and reawakened the profession's social reform spirit. Some private agency workers feel that government programs, well, now we have them, we don't have to serve the poor. However, thousands of social workers do take public sector jobs and or become activists. The radical rank and file movement calls for unionization rather than professionalization and critiques the New Deal for doing too little. As the economy recovers, social work revives its pursuit of professionalism, especially private clients and services. Social work schools stress positive science, but shy away from community organizing that promotes rather than contains change, while social policy, the welfare state, embeds systemic racism. The 40s and 50s, we get World War I, the Great Migration, and social movements, and then McCarthyism. While social movements, they press for an expanded welfare state. World War II, post-war prosperity, and McCarthyism put a tight lid on reform and dissent. Social work turns inward, away from the poor and from structural racism. Diagnostic functional caseworkers debate proper treatment. Other clinicians pursue psychoanalysis, private practice, middle-class clients, and move towards quantitative research. Some brave social workers called for social actions and macro education, but few listened. Bob Fisher, who I think is in the room, reported in the 1950s that only 13% of all social work dissertations addressed history. Then came the 60s, the war on poverty, welfare rights movement, student uprisings. Social work returns to social action. Some practitioners oppose the war on poverty, but many others take job in the new programs. Activist social works challenge the effectiveness of casework, propose new casework, CO, social policy, and history courses, and some support civil rights. Enrollment soar, including more, but still too few, persons of color. In 1962, social work formally, and may I say finally recognizes community organizing as a legitimate method, but continues to devalue it along with social policy. CO has never accounted for more than 10% of all MSW students, and historical dissertations fell from 13% to 6.4% in the 1960s. The slight macro expansion lasted into the early 70s, but until neoliberalism took hold. Neoliberalism, we see an economic crisis associated with globalization, deindustrialization, and economic stagnation. Neoliberalism reverses 60 years of Keynesian policies. The neoliberal call for free market, small government, privatization, austerity restructures the social order, including social work. To retain its now well-established professional status, social work, happily or not, incorporates the neoliberal business model. Also known as managerialism, schools and agencies increasingly tie themselves to clinical practice and behavioral science. They support advocacy, and as Michael Reich reports, scale back historical courses. 3 neoliberal goals take hold in social work education. Accountability. Schools begin to measure the performance of faculties and programs using competencies or quantifiable practice behaviors. Second, productivity. We reward large research grants, empirical research published in high impact journals while devaluing advocacy. And finally, efficiency. All universities have greater reliance on adjunct faculty, and outside forces seek to end the tenure system altogether. Historical dissertations fell from 6.4% to 5% in the 1970s, and to a mere 1.4% in 1995 when Fisher's research ended. In 1926, back then, Jane Addams warned of the danger of looking at social work too steadfastly from the business point of view, subjecting it to tests which are totally irrelevant to its purposes. In 2018, myself and Jen Zelnick titled our report on managerialism, Business as Usual, a wake-up call to the human services. I'd like to end by saying, never forget what has been done can be undone. Social workers have always organized to resist the marginalization of macro social work and social policy. Today, the Social Welfare History Group and all webinar participants can organize to bring history back into social work education. And at the bottom of my slide, please see the names of people whose historical accounts I relied on for this discussion. Thank you. Next, we're back to Zach, who's going to talk about the Social Welfare History Group.
Okay, yes, my role in our event today is to put in context the development of the Social Welfare History Group as an effort to counter the marginal status of social welfare history in social work and in history since the time of its founding and up to the present day. And in thinking about this, I began, of course, with Bob Fisher's seminal article on the subject, which provides excellent background on the group's early development. One of the most important things that emerges in looking at this history, I think, are some important parallels with our own times, as I will elaborate on in this talk. The Social Welfare History Group began notably in the shadow of McCarthyism, and also in a period of significant upheaval and ferment in social work education. The immediate precipitating action leading to the founding of the group was a session on social values and social action, the intellectual basis illustrated in the study of history at the January 1956 annual program meeting of the Council on Social Work Education, given by the noted social work educator Carl Deschines. As the first newsletter of the group, issued in December of 1956, reported, this led to a suggestion that some, and I'm quoting, some method be found to maintain continued attention to this subject. This suggestion took the form of what was initially called the Committee on the Study of the History of Social Welfare, an organization that changed its name to the Social Welfare History Group in 1962. Newsletters have been published more or less continuously since this time. And concurrently, the group has issued bibliographies on scholarship in social welfare history. Now, as indicated, the emergence of this group following the McCarthyite attacks on social reform in a decade generally considered hostile to social welfare, reflected what Fisher called, and I quote, a turn away from the 1950s and towards areas less constrained by conservative models and politics. The Social Welfare History Group also emerged in the context of significant curricular debate and resulting reform in social work education. Those who studied social welfare history, like Deschines, were concerned, as we are today, with maintaining and strengthening the place of social welfare history in the social work curriculum. However, although organizers of the famous 1959 CSWE curriculum study were receptive to including history as one of the areas emphasized in that study, this was later dropped. As the report of the study noted, consideration was given to the inclusion of a project on the history of social welfare. After due deliberation, it was decided that the history of welfare was not properly an area of the social work curriculum. It was then, in a context where history was being marginalized in social work education, that this group initially emerged. Another important aspect of the early social welfare history group was its efforts to break down interdisciplinary barriers to this important field of study. While efforts to engage historians in the early years were limited to a relatively small group of historians then studying social welfare history, This did improve somewhat in the 1960s and 70s. The group for a time had more of an interdisciplinary character, attempting to bring together social work educators engaged in the study of history of their field and the social welfare policies and programs in which it was embedded, and historians who were interested in the study of social welfare. And this was stimulated significantly by the turn to what became termed the new social welfare history in the 1960s. Perhaps in part stimulated by this, in the early 1970s, historians emerged more dominant in the leadership of the social welfare history group as social welfare history had become more central to their field. And in the 1970s and 80s, major books on social welfare history were published. Interestingly, however, as Fisher notes, the social welfare history group declined as the intellectual field of social welfare history grew, and historians lost interest in the social welfare history group, with the result that it went into a lull for nearly a decade before it was reinvigorated in the mid 1980s. The fall 1985 newsletter of the group noted, the issue of the social welfare this issue of the social welfare history group newsletter, the first in a couple of years, signifies the revival of the group after the newsletter, annual bibliographies, and business meetings were temporarily suspended in the early 1980s. Now, since this time, there have been periods where the social welfare history group has been more active and periods where membership and interest have waned. The interdisciplinary collaboration that founders had hoped for has been only partially achieved at various points in its history. And over the last several decades, the group has become largely a social work-based organization with relatively limited membership. We hope that this panel can contribute to changing this. Now, today, we see a political economic context that, while certainly not identical to the 1950s, does show parallels with that earlier period. The turn to extreme right-wing reaction exemplified in Trumpism has again promoted renewed interest in the study of history. Critiques of white supremacy embedded in the field of social work and its educational establishment are again promoting examination of social work's curriculum with an eye towards history. And this context has again provided then both impetus and opportunity for those of us who, like Carl Deschinitz and his generation of scholars, want to promote the role of historical teaching and scholarship in the field. To this end, we in the Social Welfare History Group have recently reinstituted the bibliographies of scholarship on social welfare history with a new twist, which is a topical focus. The first, issued shortly after COVID hit, focused on social work's response to pandemics. The second, sparked by the focus on police violence following the murder of George Floyd, collected research on social work and policing. And we have others planned. Another initiative that we have recently engaged in is establishing a doctoral student study group that brings together emerging scholars interested in studying social welfare history in their dissertation projects. We also hope to be able to offer periodic workshops such as this one that help raise the position of history and social work scholarship and research. And so with that background on our group and its work having been provided, let me now turn this over to our next panelist, Dr. Justin Harty.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, my name is newly minted Justin Harty from the University of Chicago Crown School. I'm soon to be assistant professor at Arizona State University School of Social Work. I'm also the Social Welfare History Group secretary. So I'm going to be talking today a little bit about the untold histories that have largely been devalued and omitted in social work history, largely non-white social work history. The dominant narrative in social work history kind of portrays the profession as being founded and driven by Europeans. Most histories of social work go back to the English poor law and how they were kind of brought to the States. Narratives of social work's past, largely skip over key contributions of social workers, persons of color in marginalized groups. For example, they skip over the self-help and mutual aid traditions of Blacks during slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights. Skip over the indigenous efforts in resisting settler colonialism and suppression of indigenous knowledge within social work. Latinx and Asian efforts to resist political and economic dominance, exploitation and social policy get skipped over, as does in many ways LGBT efforts to address discrimination in social services. And I argue, the Social Welfare History Group argues that to have a more accurate social work historical record, the contributions of persons of color and these marginalized groups must be included. Also, we need a more complete historical record in order to understand some of the hidden dynamics within social work. Social work has historically contributed towards racism, oppression, social control. It's also historically struggled to take action against racial hatred, racial discrimination, and systemic racism within the profession. Additionally, racism within social work has been used as a tool of whiteness to construct and maintain different types of colonization, including settler colonialism, planter colonialism, imperial colonialism, often as means of social control. However, these parts of our profession's past are often absent in historical narratives, mainly in predominantly white academic institutions. Our profession's historical record must include discussions around these atrocities that we've committed against populations of color in marginalized groups, just as much as we discuss the ways in which our profession has been helpful to these communities. Social work's historical record must include the repeated attempts by social workers of color to compel our profession to engage in anti-racism and decolonization work in the profession's largely historical failure to meaningfully achieve these goals. The social work record must also include histories of resistance by populations of color and marginalized groups against racialized systems of colonization affecting all populations of color, such as neo-colonialism, police colonialism, and welfare colonialism, in efforts in resistance to combat or to resist against these often forms of social control. We also think that the historical record needs ongoing correction and reflection. We saw major efforts to correct omissions and deficiencies in our social work historical record in the 70s and 90s. Research during this time centered on correcting omissions and the deficiencies in the historical record. These efforts often would center on highlighting the many diverse contributions of social workers and communities of color to confront racism, colonialism, and inequality in the profession. For example, there have been numerous books and articles on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and LGBTQ social workers and their resistance against inequality and social control within the profession. There are also books that took a larger critiques of the profession, such as Mark Courtney's text that challenged the profession's aims and goals. After that time, there was a lull, progress slowed. Fortunately, we're seeing a recent resurgence in this effort. For example, we see texts like Martin's text on spirituality in the Black helping tradition, and Yusan Park's book on social work's role during the Japanese internment. However, we need to continue this investigation into social work among social workers of color and other marginalized groups to continually engage with these discussions and to continually correct past inaccuracies and omissions, as well as detail the efforts that are currently being made to address these issues, again, within the social work profession. So with that, I would like to pass it on and like to hear from Dr. Laura Curran.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Curran. I'm a faculty member at the Rutgers University School of Social Work. So I'm going to speak today a little bit about both facilitators and potential barriers in supporting historical scholarship in schools of social work. So as my colleagues have already addressed, one of the major facilitators and why we're kind of taking advantage of this moment right now is there's clearly a resurgence and reemergence of interest in history amongst both the general public as well as social workers. And as noted, really the activists and the intellectuals associated with the BLM movement have really publicly discussed the ways in which the deep historical racial inequalities continue to fuel and shape contemporary inequalities. And probably, our public imagination, the public imagination has been sparked by certainly probably the most famous one is the 1619 Project. But that's also, infiltrated as well the social work imagination. And the second factor really is, as others have spoken about, is the threats that we see both home and abroad to multiracial democracy. And that has again sparked a public discussion looking back really at the 20th century in terms of how do we fight autocracy and really fascism. So essentially, in a nutshell, both the public and social workers are beginning to recognize that history matters. So that's a very important facilitator. The second facilitator, as we've spoken about as well, is that there actually is a tradition of historical scholarship within the Social Work Academy. And many schools of social work actually do have faculty on staff that study history. And I did a quick peruse of the 30 schools of social work. And I actually found that out of that, about half, almost 15, there were about 15 faculty members who actually engaged in historical research. And that's not always what we might think. So it's really important to understand that we actually do have folks who know how to do this work in our discipline. Now, many folks are mid or later career, so that's people. So we do want to start thinking about the importance of a pipeline, but we are out there. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The other thing that's important in terms of a facilitator is CSWE still does continue to mandate in their accreditation standards that that social workers do have to study history. And there is a competency that does include historical knowledge and analysis skills. So that's really important. And then finally, as Dr. Harty mentioned, we are hungry as a discipline as we recognize the deep roots of white supremacy to correct our historical record and fill in that missing historical knowledge base. So with that said, we have these factors that are facilitating this interest, but what potential barriers are we facing? Or really, how can we, or do we have the institutional capacity to develop and sustain historical scholars? Well, first we need to think of our doctoral training and mentoring. And so with a couple of well-known exceptions, the University of Minnesota, of course, being one of them, most doctoral students in our field are not getting deep historical training in terms of content or methods. However, with that said, this is a barrier that we believe can be overcome. First of all, at all universities, we have the option in our doctoral programs to offer levels of interdisciplinary training across the host universities. And as we know, there are ways to cross-check institutions as well and create dissertation committees and mentors across various institutions. The second potential barrier for us are scholarly outlets. And generally speaking, there are not scholarly outlets specifically for this type of work within social work, although we do have some well-known high-profile journals, of course, Social Service Review, as well as journals such as Affiliate that welcome and are friendly towards historical scholarship. We also know that conferences tend not to be have historical tracks, although there are some shifts in this as well. Increasingly, we've been able to kind of work outside of normative conferences and bringing folks together, such as this. CSWE still hosts the Social Welfare History Group and has its own track. And certainly, again, this is something that we can overcome and work with as a discipline. The third potential barrier that I want to speak about is peer review and our disciplinary standards. Now, as we've discussed, broadly speaking, since the late 1990s, early 2000s, and as a result of a number of converging historical forces, social work standards for peer review, and particularly in the US, have increasingly aligned with standards in the behavioral and the health sciences. And as we all know, we now have increasingly high levels of productivity in terms of publication rates and higher levels of extramural grant funding. And this has contributed to robust knowledge production and dissemination and impact. So that is important to recognize. It's also contributed to greater levels of recognition and opportunities for academic social work. At the same time, however, as we've acknowledged, this was a bit of a pendulum shift, as certainly in earlier periods, social work research identified more as applied sociology rather than a health or behavioral science. And as some also argue, this has epistemological implications as well, and ones that weren't always friendly towards a more interpretive, contextualized historical study. But my main point here is that this shift creates challenges for social work scholars whose work is more aligned with humanistic inquiry, and history in particular, as it sits between a social science and the humanities. These challenges, as many of you may know, include the fact that the pace of historical research is slower. While there are opportunities for collaboration, it is not team science as we now define it. And of course, funding opportunities are more limited. And even the most prestigious awards in historical research really don't offer a large amount of funding. And so collectively, this can create barriers and fears for young scholars and academics coming down the pipeline, and it can discourage the work. So the question is, young scholars are faced with are really, can I be successful in the Social Work Academy doing this type of work? So as this panel is arguing, and if you buy into this argument, we want to say that there's room and a need for historical inquiry and knowledge within the big tent of the Social Work Academy. And thus we have to respect these differences and find ways disciplinary-wide and institution and cross institutions for young scholars to do this type of work. And we need this type of work to fill in that historical record, to really, and to face many of the large scale structural challenges that we're trying to overcome today. And now I would like to pass on this discussion to Dr. Toft.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Toft. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and I'm the vice president of the Social Welfare History Group. And as an academic, I have taught 25 MSW and doctoral history of social welfare and social work courses. And based in part on this experience, I will add to the case for the need for social welfare history and social work education, research, and practice today. First, education. Most students know little of the profession's history and even the United States history when they walk through the classroom doors. My aim when I teach social welfare history courses is to remedy this, but to also foster deliberation and critical reflection. I've typically assigned A New History of Social Welfare by Phyllis Day and Jerome Sheely, unfortunately recently out of print, that privileges the people's voice. I also assigned the Wenneker and Reich text from Charity to Enterprise. Both apply a political, economic, sociological, and cultural critique of the welfare state and the social work profession. To supplement, I assigned social work primary text, and I've sought out historical social work with scholarship from less represented communities. Podcasts such as the 1619 Project, documentaries on Native American boarding schools, and the Reveals investigative journalism are just about a few ways I've included more voices. These courses have generated deep student conversations about the evolution of the United States, the people affected, the politics that led to social welfare policies, and their impacts. Students are keenly interested in the profession's history, its intellectual traditions, its professional interests, its harms and benefits to those it served. The historical through line then leads us to the present effects of neoliberalism on social welfare policy, administration, agency management, and social work practice. We consider how historical discriminatory narratives have been resurrected during the neoliberal era to legitimize the 40 years of austerity, privatization, and individual responsibility. We lift up historical resistance that called for social responsibility, full inclusion, and discuss how social workers could leverage such activism and narrative today. In these courses, students engaged not just in critical thinking, but thinking that engages their critical conscience. For these reasons, we encourage schools of social work to require social welfare and social work historical coursework in MSW and doctoral programs. Distinct courses, if possible, and to integrate history into every course. Next, social work research. Well, first, on a pragmatic note, doctoral history courses provide opportunity for early scholarship, often as a solo or first author. In our PhD course, students write and present an original historical research paper. Material is readily available in archives, university libraries, and public websites. In historical research, students can develop various data analysis methods, from quantitative analysis of large historical data sets to interpretive analytic methods such as phenomenology, thematic analysis, grounded theory, analytic induction. Second, historical scholarship demands new researchers investigate their topic, which typically reflects their present-day scholarly interests. What is the etiology of the research topic? What economic considerations, social concerns, and political interests have shaped it over time? Third, history courses reveal that current epistemological paradigms like positivism change in their ability to satisfactorily explain the social world. We see this play out today in the abolitionist-based critique of evidence-based and risk-based practice. Research paradigms can and do change. Finally, historical research illustrates that social work has always borrowed theories and concepts from other disciplines: psychology, sociology, economics, political science, philosophy, cultural studies, gender studies, legal studies, environmental studies, and so on. As a professional discipline working in the life world of people, history helps us to continually reestablish and grow our necessary intellectual breadth to address questions of human well-being and social justice. So for these reasons, we recommend doctoral programs institute historical research courses. And we also urge that a new convention in social work scholarship be established, that dissertations historically situate their studies, and journal manuscripts do too. For the same reasons, peer-reviewed journals should solicit and publish more historical articles. Next, social work practice. Social work students who've taken a critical social welfare history course learn humility. History teaches us that social forces and institutions are powerful, and importantly, that we are differentially affected by them. But history confirms that people also have agency to resist in groups and movements through leaders' rhetorical claims. And history urges social workers to think and critique, not blindly follow bureaucratic directives. History also teaches perseverance and even optimism. It reveals that social conditions change, emboldening us to reach for justice in practice. We are in a dynamic, epic movie, not a framed snapshot of predetermined outcomes. Social work's professional institutions should also foster historical study, awareness, and discussion in social work practice. This includes support from social work programs in their universities and colleges, but also NASW and its state chapters, CSWE, SWIR, state boards of social work, and the Association of Social Work Boards. For these reasons, we recommend the profession's institutions sponsor and promote historical continuing education for practicing social workers. Professional institutions should fund stipends for instructors to develop historical courses and to learn to teach social welfare history. Professional institutions should fund historical research of academics and students, especially from diverse backgrounds. And social work research institutions should create distinct history tracks at their conferences to reinforce and develop the scholarship. The January 6th attack on the Capitol and the rise of authoritarianism everywhere are serious threats to multiracial and multi-ethnic democracies. And this hits home. The 2019 CSWE statistics show that close to 50% of BSW and MSW students are persons of color, and the vast majority are female, based on my classes, non-binary. Social work students today are demanding that the Academy does more to address issues of racial, economic, and gender justice. And as Bob Fisher observed, such eras renew interest in historical study of oppressed groups and political action as a way to understand and engage the present. Yet we need the Academy's commitment to take on this work. Alfred Kadushin, in the first issue of the Journal of Education for Social Work in 1965, warned that the social work education was not delivering an intellectually rigorous course of study. He maintained social workers needed a knowledge base that was broad and deep. We must know ourselves as social workers, as a profession, as a country. James Baldwin said, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And he also said, the past is an inheritance, a gift, and a burden. It can't be shirked. You carry it everywhere. There is nothing for it but to get to know it. Now we're going to the question and answer session, and I will pass it on to Jake Otis, a PhD student at the University of Minnesota and the facilitator of this next section.
All right, thank you, Dr. Toft, and thank you to the panelists. So now the panel will be addressing a handful of questions we've been accruing in the chat. We'll have roughly about 5 or 10 minutes or so for this portion. So after the panelists respond to these questions, we will open up the discussion to hear directly from participants. So the first question is, how do we join a PhD study group? Is there a place to find information about events and activities?
I can take that one. I will find a way to put it in the chat, but you can email me. Mimi and I will be heading up the group along with a couple of other doctoral students. As I pass the baton happily, it's an exciting opportunity to meet with other doctoral students who are trying to engage historical work in multiple ways, in their dissertation, in group projects, in class assignments. Also those that are just interested in meeting with other students to talk about the history. So I will make sure that my email is in the chat. You can email me directly, and I'm happy to include you in that listserv.
Jay, can I just add one thing to that real quickly? The doctoral students interested in history are so important. We cannot correct any of the historical omissions that have just been documented by each of the speakers unless we have faculty who can teach history to bachelor's, master's, and other doctoral students. So we have to interest doctoral students in the study of history. The schools have to support and recognize it. Otherwise, that's the only way that we're going to accomplish the goals that have been set out here. So doctoral students in the room, you're really important. Please join this discussion.
And sorry, one quick thing. I also forgot to mention, Kit Ginsky is also leading the doctoral student group with Mimi and I. So if you email me, I'll connect you with all three of us, and we're happy to have anyone join that wants to.
All right, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. Next question, how can social work engage the social welfare scholarship that has been ongoing within the historical profession since the 70s?
I can take that one. I mean, I think there are many opportunities too. So from a curriculum side, much of that work can be integrated into current courses. So whether it doesn't have to just be in that one history class that some of us that some schools of social work have, but it can also be in behavioral health classes. It can be in there's lots of written about the history of child welfare, right? So that can be integrated into child welfare or child well-being oriented classes. So any substantive class, I think there is room for that type of scholarship to be brought in. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, historical scholarship, for work that's actually being, in terms of knowledge production, folks who are creating knowledge, whether it's doctoral students or current scholars, can engage in dialogue in existing historical scholarship out there. So I think it's both on the classroom and curricular end, as well as working with and being in conversation with existing work from historians. And that's much of what I think we do as social work historians. Perhaps in some cases not enough as we should, but we do it.
And we can encourage, as Jessica said, I'm going to steal some of your recommendations, Jessica, because they're really good on this point. Like, conferences, journals should welcome, encourage, award this kind of research, which is another way to stimulate it.
I'll add one thing to that too. If at your university you have, like Laura was saying, a substantive historical course, I took a class like that and got a wonderful historian to be on my dissertation committee. And so that was a great way to have a connection with a historian who has really helped shape my dissertation and my thinking about issues that continues to inform me today. So another avenue.
To your knowledge, have other social science fields faced similar reductions towards the study of history in doctoral programs?
Well, I guess if we want to make a guess at it, probably yes. There's probably never enough in the beginning, but there was some, I think, Laura, you had said once that there was the history of medicine is something that's been well studied, and maybe law, but the neoliberal pressures that have been identified by several of the speakers suggest that it's getting pushed out of the curriculums, I'm guessing, in most places. Why would social work be unique in that regard?
Yeah, let me just add, in my interactions with colleagues in other disciplines, I think there is, in general, a marginalization of history. There has been a marginalization of history. Part of that is driven by research funding, but part of it is also driven, as Mimi has suggested, by the pressures of neoliberalism, I think.
All right. And then for the sake of time, I know there are a few other questions. I'll be sending those out to the panelists after our discussion today. So for our last part of our discussion, we're going to be taking comments directly from participants. So if you'd like to share something with the panelists and our participants, you can use the raise hand option, which is located underneath the reactions towards the bottom. And if I see your hand up, I will select you and unmute you and then invite you to share. So at this time, if you have anything you'd like to share towards the group and the panelists, we invite you to do so.
These could be comments as well as questions. Comments are very welcome.
All right, looks like Judy, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this chat today. I am getting ready to retire from teaching, but I did do some study of history in my doctoral program at Michigan State University, and it's an ongoing interest of mine, history, just in general. And I think, going back to the idea of have other disciplines marginalize history also. I mean, we just look at what is happening to public education in terms of, not being able to teach critical race theory or really just teach American history anymore, that it's all being marginalized. And I think that this group needs to keep raising their voice to not let it be marginalized in social work. Mimi, I love your writing. I've always used your work in my policy classes. And again, just thank you for this talk today.
Right. Looks like Dr. Goodenough.
I just wanted to share, I'm Karen Goodenough from NASW Minnesota chapter, and I love our historical archives, did some of my doctoral research there also. I have struggled to get our academics to present at our conference. And I know our academics want to present at CSWE and the SWR and all of the, big fancy peer-reviewed things, but practitioners want to hear this content. Like the things that several of you were commenting on are things that our members are consistently saying, we don't hear that historical background. We haven't heard that in our classes, especially folks who've come from schools where there is no good, solid history course. And so I really would encourage all the academics in the room to think about presenting at your local NASW conference when you have solid, any message from history that you think is important for today's practice. I think there's a massive disconnect happening right now. I feel it, particularly in Minnesota, that people are consistently wanting to hear from our academics and not knowing where to find them once they're done with school, and they're not hearing what they're looking at. So I think that's an opportunity for us to lift up this history once people are out of school and can see beyond everything they've been, they're so overwhelmed when they're in school learning what is social work and what is this field and what am I doing and that sort of thing. And once they get out, they might hear that context differently also. So that would be my encouragement for all of you as another opportunity to share your ideas. I would love to host you at our conferences. Absolutely. And there's a couple of you I'll be reaching out to. Look for my emails.
All right, I think we have time for one more comment. Jim, I see your hand up there. I'll send you a little message to unmute.
I'm glad I'm at a distance because I'm going to ask a question that you're not going to like. If you were dealing with doctoral students right now, they're concerned about trying to get jobs in an increasingly competitive environment, not only to get the jobs, but to keep the jobs. Why would you want to encourage them to study history as a practical matter? I think that a lot of us who do social welfare history have also combined it with an awful lot of other things that are much more topical and contemporary as a way of surviving. And I know Laura is nodding there. She understands that. I think the problem that we have is largely with the university, as much as it is with our own profession. And we don't make those rules. And the neoliberal cast of the university, which I would argue goes back beyond 1970. I mean, Clark Kerr's Learning Factory was pretty neoliberal in its orientation, have made it extremely difficult to do not just history, but other forms of interpretive work. But we have to be careful, I think, about how we counsel doctoral students to survive in the academy. When I retired from my job, and the Bryn Mawr College School of Social Work was planning its curriculum for the future, one of my colleagues in planning said, well, we don't need the historian. And I think that's the attitude in a lot of places as faculties become smaller, as universities demand that people raise their own salaries through grants, as journals are concerned with impact factor. All of these things make it extremely difficult to make a living doing history of any kind. So something to think about. I would be troubled in not pointing that out to doctoral students and helping them create a way to have it both ways, as it were, to be able to do the research that will get them tenure. And history may have to be a hobby. It's long been mine.
Thank you very much, Jim, for your observations and the work that you've done. And I think the idea that the present circumstances play into what is needed today, I think help shift some of the balance of power. Here I am in Minneapolis, where the George Floyd tragedy occurred. Our school, for months and months afterwards, was rallying around the Social Work Academy, our university, our school, to do something about it. And I think at that point, there was a real groundswell of support for getting more political, more social, more contextual. And I think actually the opposite occurred, that when there were messages of science and working around the edges and fixing social problems with science, that students didn't care for it, they didn't like it. And there are funders too. They fund that, and the public universities, but it's only even 20% of our funding actually comes from our state legislatures anymore. So I think that there are, history changes. I think there are moments where we can step through a door that's opening, that policy window that's opening. And I think that we're in one of them right now. And I think, unfortunately, the last 40 years under neoliberalism, it's not been the case. But I think that since we do have some agency, we should just push that window open, walk through that door, and make the most of it, what we can at the moment. I'm sounding like a cheerleader, but that's my impression about counter pressures that have actually pushed against what you're saying there.
Also, I just can add, social change requires pressure from below or from the side or from wherever. And, we had about 200 people register for this webinar. And I consider that a source of pressure that can be applied, the interest that's reflected in that in our institutions. So yes, you're totally right, Jim, about what the reality is. There's no doubt about it, but either we stand with it and let it rule, or we exert pressure, such as this conversation hopefully will do and be continued, to change people's minds, whether it's the especially the universities who hire. There was a lot of demand from students saying they wanted this coursework, and then maybe, the universities would say, oh, well, we'll have to take them because they'll go to another school. The process of how social change takes place. So we can try to be a force, if only a small force, on a singular topic of trying to make the universities more responsive to this. It will take a while. It won't happen tomorrow, and doctoral students will have to negotiate that terrain. There's no doubt about it. But Zach will tell you later about it. We're going to try to bring people together again to do just that.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here. I think this is the beginning of an effort to try and do something about that issue that you identify, and to hopefully create leverage points where we can have historical scholarship in social work and in other professional fields honored in the academy. And like Mimi has alluded to, Jessica's talked to, I think that involves us coming together and trying to see if we can do that. Clearly there is a student demand. I know in my university, students are crying out for the study of history, asking us to talk about these things. And it's important then to have faculty who are able to offer this background, which is so important. And so this is the beginning of that effort, and we ask folks to join us.
And I'd like to say just one quick thing. Jim, what you said just now completely captures the conversations that the social welfare history doctoral group, that doctoral students have been talking about. And this, we want to do historical research, but when it's not be assigned in our classes, when it's not expected of us, and when, and if, some folks have received resistance against it in their dissertations. And when it takes time to do it, when we're kind of worried about publish or perish, there's a lot of reasons on why we would just move on to something else. And and like you, I'm very interested in social work, social welfare history, but it's become a hobby of mine. My dissertation is on something completely different. And I think unless we're given incentives, unless we receive better support on this, I think we'll continue to see this lull in doctoral students moving on to something else besides historical social work research.
Didn't mean to be such a wet blanket.
I thought that was a great question. And I also want to mention, I've received a question in the chat. I'm not sure the rest of you saw it, that why hasn't there been a social work history journal? If we had one of those, I'm going to ask the panelists myself, would that allow for more opportunities for publishing? Would it lift the profile, etc.?
You know, I do mostly alcohol and drug related history. And I think that creating the Alcohol and Drug History Society's creation of it used to be not much more than a newsletter. Now it's a real journal. I mean, the University of Chicago Press distributes it. I think that's helped there quite a bit. And I think personally, I think that's a really good idea. I think one of the questions is, how do you bound what social welfare is? And I would argue, keep it wide open.
You know, there's always a tension between segregating an issue or topic in one place, like one history course, one journal, or integrating it. And I would argue for both. We need, you know, but if you just segregate, just have one of it, then only those who are interested go there, and it doesn't affect the whole field. So we want to try to give a place for those who want to go in that at least deeper, and also places for those who need the exposure and maybe to spark their interest in historical research that they will carry forward in their own way.
All right, I'll jump in. I see a couple hands up. I don't know. I think Meryl, your hand was up first, so I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, I just want to put in a plug for teaching in undergraduate social work programs. There are a number of us who are interested in social welfare history, teaching in those programs. And although the pressures for publishing, presenting, getting grants have definitely increased, I don't think there's as much of a slant toward not including historical research. So I think it's an opportunity. They're different than teaching in a Research One university, but nevertheless, very worthwhile.
And then for the sake of time, one last comment from the chat, and then we'll start wrapping up. And that is about a special interest group at SWIR. So any thoughts from the panelists?
Just really quickly, I'll take that on. Yeah, we would like to start one. So you'll probably be hearing more from us. We do have a listserv now from this group. So we'll probably send out information about that.
Also, this webinar was originally to be a roundtable at SWIR, so it has its roots there as well.
All right, let me jump in here then to close us out. And so on behalf of my colleagues in the Social Welfare History Group, we really want to thank you for participating in this discussion. But as we have alluded to, this is just the beginning. We want you to join the Social Welfare History Group. You can do that by emailing me, as you can see from the slide. We are also, we put you on the listserv. We'll give you notice about our new events, the new bibliographies we're posting. We're planning to hold a second meeting to strategize next steps on Wednesday, June 15th. You can see the time on the screen. We'll send out information to everyone who attended this session, including the link of the recording to this panel discussion. And out of all this, we hope to expand the contribution of history in the field of social work in the 21st century. And so thank you all again for attending, and thank you for your support of this important work.